This week at the agenda saw the conflict between privacy and security in a post-9/11 era, a world waiting for war, and two sides of the taser debate here at home. The agenda's Week in Review begins with Ontario's political summer and what that portends for PC leader Tim Hudak. You would think that in a summer where the Conservatives win their first seat in Toronto in 14 years, that would be an unambiguously good news story for the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. After all, they've gone 0 for 66. And if you add up all the potential, 22 seats, 3 elections in a row, nothing. And yet, in the immediate aftermath of the by-elections, the knives start to come out for Tim Hudak in a very public way. How come?
I think that maybe this is perhaps not an exercise in trying to get Tim Hudak out, but just to kind of make him eat humble pie and say, yes, perhaps I'm not doing what I should be doing to win. Maybe I'm not putting or doing the best I can to ensure that we win the next election. So perhaps these are a few members who don't necessarily want to kick him out. They just want him to change what he's doing. And just going back to the party president, this was a guy who when he ran for that position at the AGM in Niagara Falls, his motto was, "Are you tired of losing elections?" So, and he put a lot of money and effort into that campaign for an unpaid position. So I'm not saying that he's interested in the job, but I'm saying that he's very seriserious about that party and running it.
Well, you're not saying he is, but everybody else is. And I hear he's even got a riding picked out.
But he's denied it. He's denied it. Yeah. But I mean, it's very interesting what's going on in the PC party right now, and whether they come out of this unscathed will be very interesting too.
Just for fun, with all these disclaimers we've uttered about by-elections and so on, the one certainty we can draw from all of this is that leadership reviews are utterly meaningless, because Hudak won a year ago, I think 78% plus or minus in his review, and now a year and a half later he's facing a revolt. In Quebec, you mentioned Quebec politics, Pauline Marois famously won about a 95% leadership review when she was in opposition, and about 6 or 12 months later a massive party revolt was brewing, suppressed, and now she's the Premier of Quebec. So you never know with these things.
We don't quite have, though, a Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin situation here, right? Where there's somebody nipping at the heels of the current leader to get him out. I mean, I don't hear anybody saying, we got to get rid of Tim Hudak because we're unambiguously for that guy right over there, right? So there's no obvious heir apparent. And yet there is this undertow constantly that's following Hudak wherever he goes. How do you explain that?
That's what makes this so incoherent, right? Is that there is no obvious person to go in. The people whose names occasionally come up, Vic Fideli, the MP from North Bay, you'll hear his name occasionally. I've seen nothing to suggest he's particularly lobbying for the job or wants it. Christine Elliott's name comes up. There's some you hear mixed accounts of how interested she is or whether she's completely 100% supportive or not. But again, she doesn't seem to be pushing for it in the short term.
There's nobody who's stolen the party away from Hudak in the way that Martin did from Chrétien.
So what happens at the head of leadership? Somebody might squeak in. I mean, I suppose if you're looking at it, let's say that the Richard Ciano party president theory is correct. I'm not saying that it necessarily is. Maybe that might be why he'd look at it and say, well, with only 20% support coming in, I might be able to win this thing because there's no clear successor. I mean, the obvious danger for them is that if they don't win the next election, there is no obvious successor for them. And with all the turmoil and so on, you wonder who'd want the job. You wonder, what party membership would be like. And it's the kind of thing where you could see this party facing a real ugly period after if they do lose the next election, and there's all kinds of turmoil before, because they seem to have created a culture here where nobody is satisfied with anybody. Nobody's ready to rally around anybody.
But my question, Martin, is what do they want? When people are upset, they say, Tim Hudak's doing a bad job of X, Y, and Z. What's the X, Y, and Z?
What he's doing wrong, you mean?
Yeah.
Why are they unhappy? Oh, that's a different. I think Hudak has some liabilities and/or limitations. I don't think that's going to disqualify him as leader in the foreseeable future. But what's bugging people is that he's not connecting with Ontarians. He's not.
What does that even mean, though?
Okay, he's not does not come across as especially authentic on television, for example. He is overly scripted. He tends to rehearse and really work hard at getting his press lines right. He compares unfavorably, I would say, and I'm not trying to be ideological here, because I'm paid to watch them. It's my job, day in and day out. He compares unfavorably to both Andrea Horwath and Kathleen Wynne on authenticity. They come across, even though Andrew Horvath reads her lines a lot too, they come across as more genuine. Tim Hudak tries too hard. So that's one big thing. I think his policies perhaps are not a great fit for Ontario right now, barring the kind of post-NDP rebellion that we saw in 1995. So I think he has a few things going against him. He's not raising a lot of money either.
Go ahead.
I agree with much of the problem with Tim Hudak. I think probably everybody at this table has had the same conversation about him at some point, which is, why is it that he can't get the way he is off camera into the frame when he's on camera? Because if you've talked to him off camera, he's this quite likable, quite easygoing guy who, you know, he fits the sort of, would you want to have a beer or barbecue with this guy or whatever kind of qualification, which he really doesn't on TV. That being said, in fairness to him, the one thing to keep in mind here is that this, the viewers of the show possibly accepted, this is not a province where people pay super close attention between elections. A lot of the negativity, I think, is still based on the first time they saw him in the 2011 campaign, where he ran a pretty bad campaign. I'm not saying he'll necessarily make a better impression next time, but I do think his only one shot, and all along his only shot all along has been this, is in the next campaign, to reintroduce himself. And you can't really expect that opinions are going to shift heavily about him between elections. So to some extent, he's just paying for that first impression, and to say, how come he hasn't changed that? I think some people involved know that it's not as simple as just doing that.
Well, I think we all have a story like the one I'm about to tell, which I'll tell very briefly. I was on Manitoulin Island over the summertime for a little while, and I spoke to a guy who owns a candy store. So he's a small business person, he's around my age, small business person. You would think the natural constituent for a Conservative leader. And I asked him, what do you think of Tim Hudak? And he said, don't like him. And I said, why not? And he said, that's the fakest smile I've ever seen. And going back to what you said before about how if he were on camera the way he is off camera, he'd be a different guy. Surely they've told him this. Surely his people say, can't you be more like you are off camera, on camera? Why isn't it happening?
Well, I have seen them get rid of some of the photos where he's smiling. I mean, after the election, I mean, it was on the bus during the election, him smiling with his wife and child. And then post-election, when they had their AGM, the photos of him were very, like, more gravitas. He'd sit in an armchair and sort of look at you very authoritatively. So I think they tried to kind of, they got that. They got that that wasn't working and people didn't like it, and so I think they tried to change it. But I'm not really sure why he's not relaxing a bit in front of the camera, because he's very, even before the cameras start rolling, he's, you know, he's joking around with the reporters. It's really difficult for me to see why he can't dial it down a bit with the scripting. And I think he recognizes that as a failure on his part, but it's something he really needs to stop doing if he's going to connect with voters. And I think the party realizes that too, because they're polling pretty well. It's just that when you get to the part where do you like Tim Hudak as leader, that's when they kind of fall down. So I think they feel like he might be dragging them down a bit. And if he does some kind of image makeover, like we saw with McGuinty after the '99 election, then maybe things will go more smoothly and they'll win next time around.
You've heard this expression, a trigger-happy cop, before. When we talk about guns, I wonder whether you have any concerns about taser trigger-happy cops if this becomes part of the arsenal.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a considerable difficulty in an officer firing a gun. That is a very, very, very serious action. I don't think the same psychological barrier is there in firing a taser. Chances are this person is not going to suffer long-term health consequences or die as a result. It is excruciatingly painful. I have not been tasered. Perhaps you have. I know police officers are often tasered in training.
Have you been tasered before? No.
No, there we go.
Because I've heard that too, sometimes in training.
Well, actually, there's a technical debate about whether or not it's pain-induced or the immobilization sensation is so extreme that it's associated with pain. I'll leave the scientists to work that out. But actually, I share the same concern that we need to make sure our police officers are properly trained, properly guided, have the confidence to use the device properly with the right amount of judgment. And we invest a lot. I'd have to say on preponderance of evidence, I'm quite satisfied and quite confident that our officers will remain responsible in the use of this device. Toronto Police have had an enviable record of the deployment of CEWs.
Go ahead.
I have to add, we do have outstanding concerns about the deployment threshold. So the Braidwood Commission, which is the commission that looked into the death of Robert Jacansky, recommended a standard at which tasers should be deployed by police officers. That was when there's an imminent threat of bodily harm or death, then a police officer should be able to fire a taser to address that imminent threat. The standard in Ontario is lower than that. It is assaultive behavior, threatened assaultive behavior, or a need to control the subject. That's a very wide range of behaviors that can lead to an officer under the current use of force wheel deploying that tool. So we have additional concerns about what circumstances this weapon will be used under.
Does that need to be tightened up in your view?
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you be open to tightening up those
We're always
guidelines?
willing to look at our practices and procedures and policies that support those practices. I would point out that I would argue that we're not so far away from Braidwood, if we're far away at all, because Braidwood heavily qualified his observations that there had to be an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. In fact, he made allowances for circumstances where police officers apprehend a threat and are allowed to take action. It would be absurd for a police officer to have to actually be struck, or a police officer to have to witness somebody actually being struck or wounded before being able to intervene, and Braidwood doesn't make that point. On the other hand, in Ontario, we have a long history of using the device quite responsibly, and the threshold was a consequence of very, very careful collaboration and consideration by a lot of stakeholders. And so the ministry and the police are satisfied that the assaultive level will be appropriate for the circumstances that in Ontario police officers are going to face.
Tell me, though, if you think this is a common sense conclusion to come to. On the rare occasions when your officers have to draw their guns, that's a big deal. It's serious, right? There's who knows where the consequences go if they potentially have to use the weapon. There are forms to be filled out afterwards, maybe SIU's called in. Anyway, it's a big deal. This gives you a much sort of lower threshold option or alternative besides pulling the gun. Does it stand to reason then that cops are going to use tasers a lot more than they're going to use guns?
Oh, well, in all likelihood they will, because cops are faced with events that don't reach the lethal or serious bodily harm threshold anyway. But that still doesn't justify, just simply because an officer is facing a potential threat, doesn't justify the use of any force. The officer has to make a decision both subjectively and objectively based upon the circumstances. So all the CEW has done is introduce one more option. But also, every progressive police leader that I know is conscious that the device has generated a lot of public interest and has captured the public imagination. And so that's why it actually has a distinction in the use of force model from the other two intermediate weapons as far as threshold. So in Ontario, the threshold for the CEW is assaultive. That distinguishes it from the other intermediate force options that are available to police. And we've got practices, procedures, training, and supervision to make sure that we comply with that.
When is it okay for governments to spy on their own citizens? In June, news leaked of the National Security Agency's massive programs of cell phone and internet surveillance on the communications of American citizens. Is this type of collect-it-all surveillance a violation of the right to privacy or justified in this post-9/11 era? Joining us now on that, Ron Diebert. He's director at the Canada Centre for Global Security Studies and the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. And Ron, it's good to have you back in the studio.
Glad to be here.
Well, as we suggested, this story is a few months old already, and for those who may need a little refresher on what it's all about, what's the concern?
Well, first of all, it's a story that never dies. Snowden has only released approximately 5–10% of the documents.
This is Edward Snowden.
Edward Snowden, the NSA whistleblower who used to work for our contractor, Booz Allen Hamilton.
And some would object to the term whistleblower.
They would, yeah. That's certainly a subject for debate.
Right.
Before he fled the United States, first to Hong Kong and then to Russia, he took with him several laptops loaded with top secret documents that exposed a lot of details about the National Security Agency's surveillance. The primary concerns, I think, for most Americans were about the collection, the mass surveillance of domestic communications. One of the first, in fact, the first of the Guardian newspaper stories was about an order to Verizon, one of the telecommunications companies in the United States, to collect all metadata of American communications.
Metadata meaning?
Metadata meaning essentially not the content of the call. So if we're having a conversation not what we're saying, but the length of the call, the address of the call, in other words, my number, your number. If we're using cell phones, the geolocation of the call. It's interesting that you bring up metadata because later President Obama coyly said no one is listening in on your phone calls under this program. That may or may not be true, but they're certainly collecting all of the accompanying metadata, which I believe, in fact, is actually much more valuable when it comes to targeted surveillance.
How?
Well, when you look at it from an intelligence point of view, all of the conversations that are going on can include oblique references and maybe code words or euphemisms, but the metadata contains a lot of very precise information that can actually be used to understand very precisely not only a person's location, but to whom they're speaking, at what time, and that can allow you to map entire social networks. So it's a lot more powerful from an intelligence point of view and a lot more invasive from a privacy point of view as well.
Do we know the metadata that was collected, how specific and or general the targets were?
Well, I think it's general is the answer because as we've learned, the rule of thumb here, and I think it's not just the rule of thumb that we learned about from Edward Snowden, it goes back really to 9/11 and the sea change that happened in the NSA's operations around that time to essentially collect everything, to collect as much as possible as a starting point and then put it in a big data bucket somewhere so that it can be analyzed later. This is a really quite an astonishing change in the operational approach of the National Security Agency that I think has huge implications because we, as members of electronic society, have gone through a transformation in how we communicate, how we network within the same period of time, essentially turning our digital lives inside out. We leave bits and traces of ourselves everywhere we go today through mobile phones, social networking, our use of cloud computing. So these two things are happening simultaneously.
Do we assume that the NSA was picking up on this metadata of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of billions?
You have to assume that there are millions of conversations and transactions going on, and that's just one company. Of course, other companies have been compelled to do the same thing. On the very same day that the Verizon revelations came out, we learned also about another program called PRISM, in which major internet companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, others were also compelled to turn over information about emails, searches, and so on direct to the NSA. So it's a lot of transactions, which is in part why we know now why the NSA was also building a massive data processing facility in Utah. We're talking about a lot of information that ultimately has to go somewhere that is then processed and ultimately analyzed and disseminated.
You say the NSA compelled these organizations to turn over that information. Compelled how and
Under
upon
law.
what punishment?
Well, under law, and this again, it goes back to 9/11 to specific provisions. First, within the Patriot Act, Section 215, which requires or allows law enforcement intelligence to access what is called in the law any tangible thing related to an intelligence or foreign threat, and also compels those who are receiving that letter not to speak about it under penalty of law. So there's essentially a gag order around it, which is why when the PRISM revelations came out, many of the companies denied actually participating in it. So it's under law in the United States.
Thank you for setting the table. We're now going to invite three others to join the conversation and debate the relevance of all of what we've been talking about here. So joining us now in New York, New York, Jamil Jaffer. He is Deputy Legal Director of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. In Washington, D.C., Joshua Faust. He's a freelance journalist and former fellow at the American Security Project. And in our nation's capital, Wesley Wark, professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. And it's good to have you three join our conversation as well. Jamil, let's get you started on this one. I want everybody first off to give us your take on how concerning the revelations about the NSA program are as far as you're concerned.
Well, I mean, I think they're deeply concerning. It's an immense amount of information that the government is collecting. It's very sensitive information. Even this metadata is extremely sensitive. There's a lot that the government can deduce from information about who you called and when you called them. And obviously that's why the government wants the information, but it's also why there ought to be safeguards preventing the government from needlessly intruding on the privacy of innocent people. And right now, those safeguards don't exist at all. Instead, what the government is doing is essentially collecting everything about everybody under only the weakest limits set by a court in secret. And nobody knew about these programs at all before they were released before this information was released by Edward Snowden. So I think that there's a lot to be concerned about here, both in the scope of the programs, in the absence of meaningful safeguards for privacy, and in the secrecy that surrounded all of this.
Joshua Faust, how concerned do you think we should be about these revelations?
I think concern is completely warranted. Learning that the government collects information on this scale is definitely worrying. I think Jamil downplays the safeguard side of it somewhat in the subsequent leaks that we've had since details about both PRISM and this metadata collection program have come to light. The government's error rate in obeying its own regulations that limit its collection on American citizens has actually proven to be, I think, very, very small. Less than 1/1,000,000% of the queries that they've done against their own databases have pulled up improper information. This doesn't apply, however, to people outside of the country. And I think globally, the concern about how much information the American government is collecting is perfectly justified. The problem they run into is that as an intelligence agency dedicated to collecting foreign intelligence, it's going to do that. It's legally created to do this. Within the United States, though, the debate about how much they're actually allowed to collect, I think is bumped up against a certain ahistorical mindset that ignores both what happened after September 11th, when the entire intelligence community was mobilized and ordered to collect additional amounts of information, and also going back into history. The NSA is not shy about collecting a huge amount of information about a huge number of people. Going back into the 70s, programs like Echelon were already collecting much of the information over the internet and almost every telephone communication around the world. And this was 20 years ago with technology that was 20 years old. So we can assume that everything that they're doing is at a higher scale. It's also not new. And pretending that there's something new in a spy agency essentially spying, I think, is really missing what's truly concerning about this, which is the lack of transparency about both oversight and how accountable they're held when they do either violate the law or make mistakes.
More on that in just a bit. Wesley Wark, let me get your view on this insofar as when the story broke, President Obama said that these programs were, quote, a critical tool in protecting the nation from terrorist threats to the United States. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah. It's hard to know exactly how critical the tool, and I think the way in which this question was raised may have led people to assume that what President Obama was talking about was that there were X number of cases in which NSA intelligence alone, cracked open a terrorism offense. In reality, signals intelligence, which, as Joshua has reminded us, has been around for a very long time, is one of a number of important intelligence tools. And for a long time, it's been a premier intelligence tool. Its history goes back, in fact, to the days before the First World War. It's been around a long time, and it's been a major intelligence tool. I think the way we have to understand it is we may not know the precise details of how signals intelligence, the kind of work that NSA does, contributes to individual cases under investigation. But overall, it's a very important part of a kind of intelligence picture that a government like the United States, or indeed Canada, tries to put together. And of course, this isn't just an American story. There's a very interesting and intriguing Canadian and international dimension to what we've learned about the American program itself.
Ron, why don't you follow up on that part of it?
Well, it's very interesting comments. I agree with most everything that's been said here. I do think there has been something new about what's going on here within the last decade. Keep in mind that the NSA has been around since 1952, and as Wesley quite rightly points out, signals intelligence goes back a long time. During the Cold War, the signals intelligence agencies of the United States and other countries were mostly focused on each other in a kind of spy versus spy game. 9/11 really changed all of that. The threat became more dispersed to society as a whole, and they began to turn their lens inward on all of us. And that is a fundamental sea change that hasn't sparked the type of almost like a constitutional conversation that we have about the relationship between secretive intelligence agencies, that gather communications, all of our private communications, in the context of a society where we use these digital technologies and they are around us, they permeate everything that we do. Those two changes, I think, are fundamentally different for the age that we live in.
As the world watched and waited over the weekend, nations lined up in vocal support of military intervention in Syria, notably France and Saudi Arabia, while others voiced their opposition, notably the United Kingdom and Russia. And America, a president that wants to strike and a Congress that's thinking about it. Joining us now for the latest on the conflict and the politics at play around the globe. In Beirut, Lebanon, via Skype, Rami Khouri, director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. In Istanbul, Turkey, via Skype, Stephen Starr, journalist and author of Revolt in Syria, Eyewitness to the Uprising. And with us here in studio, Kamran Bokhari, Vice President of Middle Eastern and South Asian Affairs at the global intelligence company Stratfor, and Janice Stein, Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto and TVO's Foreign Affairs Analyst. And as I welcome you two here in our studios and our other two guests halfway around the world to our program tonight, I want to start our discussion by reading something that David Sanger wrote in the New York Times a couple of days ago to kickstart our discussion here. He writes, "There is an argument that Mr. Obama's own caution about foreign interventions put him in this box. Horrific as the August 21st chemical weapons attack was, it was no more horrific than the conventional attacks that caused the deaths of 100,000 Syrians. Those prompted only a minimal American response, international condemnations, some sporadic arms shipments for a ragtag group of rebels, and an understandable reluctance by an American president to get on the same side of the civil war as al-Nusra Front, an affiliate of al-Qaeda." All right, let's go to the region first. Rami, the United States is deciding right now whether to strike. In your view, should they?
They should not strike unilaterally. If there is a UN Security Council resolution that gives a strike legitimacy, then the U.S. and the Turks and the Arabs and anybody else who wants to be should be part of a collective international legitimate action. But unilaterally, the United States should not strike. It won't be effective. It'll cause great damage. It has no ethical base, and the consequences, as your own Bob Ray has recently written very wisely, the consequences cannot be really measured ahead of time. So no, they shouldn't strike. Stephen Starr in Istanbul, should the U.S. strike?
It's a difficult thing for me to say, being a reporter and covering the region. I think the consequences of not taking part in some extent and getting involved in some extent and sending a message to the Assad regime, whatever that may be, are far worse than simply letting things lie, letting things continue as they were. I think the Assad regime would be happy, very happy to continue what it's been doing for the last 30 or so months. Something I feel has to be done. Kamran Bokhari.
Well, I don't think it's a matter of should the United States strike at Syria. I mean, we have to look at it from the point of view of the American imperative. As the world's sole superpower, it cannot tolerate the use of chemical weapons. If you just say, okay, you know, we're going to gloss over this, then tomorrow someone else is going to use it. So you set a bad precedent. And secondly, which is from the Obama administration's point of view is much more important, is that you can't draw a red line and then not deliver on it. You look like you don't mean business, and it sends the wrong message. So from the U.S. point of view, it does have to strike. The question is how.
How about from your point of view?
Well, from my point of view, I think I agree that you can't allow people to just use chemical weapons and they're not have any consequences afterwards. And the second thing is that doing empathetic analysis, I mean, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of Obama and say, okay, can I just ignore this? And easily so. And so the answer is no, because you yourself said there's a red line, you cross it, we will act. And now that red line seemingly has been crossed, so there's time for action.
You've said seemingly, and that's going to open up a can of worms that we're going to look into a little bit later. Janice, a strike, yes or no?
Very, very reluctantly, yes, because this actually is not about Syria. It is about the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's about the Geneva Protocol. To the extent we have any norms in the international community at all, Steve, we have them against the use of chemical and biological weapons, against anybody, not only against your own civilians. You're right, there is a question of evidence still outstanding here, but assuming that that evidence is there, I think you have no choice. You can't let the use of chemical weapons go unnoticed. And it's not a matter of the numbers, it is a matter of an absolute taboo against the use of these kinds of weapons.
Can I follow up on that with you, Janice? And I'll get everybody else involved in this as well. David Sanger made the point in his piece that America was not considering an attack when 100,000 Syrians were killed by conventional methods.
Right.
But 1,400, not to minimize the number, it's horrendous, but 1,400 as compared to 100,000 have now been killed by chemical weapons, and suddenly the U.S. is exercised. So, why is gas different?
It is different. Gas is different. And I think that's a very important point to make. What is going on inside Syria is a civil war. And there is not a global norm that you intervene with force on one side or the other of a civil war. Why does gas matter? Because gas is a form of chemical weapon. And once you legitimate the use of chemical and biological weapons, which are just next up, if you allow those to go, and that's in fact what Obama did. He allowed repeated pinprick chemical attacks to go unpunished, and then we get the first large-scale use of chemical weapons since Saddam Hussein against the Kurds in Halabja.
Dead is dead. Why is gas different?
No, dead really isn't dead, because in a fundamental way, countries go to war and populations go to war, and civil wars erupt. What the international community for close to 100 years has said is, since the end of World War I, you cannot gas populations even in the middle of a war. And that's the issue that is now before the international community, and the silence is frankly deafening, Steve.
Well, let me follow up with Rami on that. You know, some will argue that dead is dead, that whether you get killed by a bullet or whether you get killed by poison gas, at the end of the day, you're still dead. So why does some of the world want to make a distinction because of gas?
Well, I think the issue of the response to the gas use is really very complicated. It's not only about the issues that Janice mentioned, which I agree with her on the fact that these weapons are prohibited. I disagree with her that the United States has any kind of legal, moral, political, or ethical mandate to actually be the enforcer of these conventions. The UN Security Council is mandated to do that. Not the American presidency. But they're different because the implications of these weapons being used in Syria, first of all, has implications for people in the region, particularly Israel and Hezbollah and Jordan and Iran and Turkey. And possibly if these get into the hands of some of the Islamist militant terrorist groups, the Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant and these groups, this is something that frightens the whole world, because some of these groups might want to carry out attacks, as they have done in Europe, North America, Australia, or other places. So there is a qualitative difference in the implications of the use of chemical weapons, but I think there's a difference between why these weapons should not be used and who's responsible for making sure that they're not used again. And that's, I think, where there's a real difference.
Rami, can I just intervene for 1 second? I mean, there is, of course, this hagiography against the UN Security Council. We all need a UN Security Council resolution. Effectively, what that does is farm out ultimate decision and responsibility to Russia and China, which are inevitably going to veto this for their own good reasons.
So is there another good housekeeping seal of approval out there short of a UN?
There isn't.
NATO?
Well, there is not really a good housekeeping seal of approval, but you know, the argument is, is that the most important thing? Or do we look, in fact, at the Geneva Conventions, at the CWC, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and say, and Syria hasn't signed, by the way, and do we just say this is a clear violation? And is there not then room, when the Security Council is deadlocked, as it's been repeatedly again and again, is there not room for a group of countries to act together?
A coalition of the willing.
That's right.
Kamran.
I think there is the legal side, you know, definitely international law, you know, Janice and Rami made the arguments. But I think that there is a reality, and the reality supersedes legality, which is that everybody's looking at the United States. What are you going to do about it? And the United States has tried to look at others and say, well, what are you going to do about it? Looking at Turkey, and it needs help. It's not in the interest. It's not as if the United States wants to go in unilaterally. No. This is not its desire. We have not seen any indication of this.
But the rest of the world expects it.
The rest of the world expects it, and therefore we can't just stick with legality. We have to look at the geopolitics, which is the geopolitical reality on the ground.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety. They're on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, or on our iTunes channel, or on our YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.